Welcome to Lesson 19, Maintaining Validation Status. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at the life cycle of validation, a validation master plan, change control system and how it interacts with the validation life cycle, revalidation, and then annual product review. So the life cycle of the validation, the overriding thing is your validation master plan. That sits on top of all of your validation activities on a site, and it details your approach to validation for the site. The part that we've been discussing so far is your commissioning and qualification. So when we think of validation, that's the main aspect that we tend to think of, the physical validation of the system. On an ongoing basis then, how do we maintain that life cycle of validation? How do we keep our equipment, our facilities, our utilities and our processes in their validated state? There are a couple of really important systems to make sure that that happens. Number one here is the change control system. So we're going to be talking about that in more detail in a minute. And also your annual product review and your revalidation policy for your site. So all of these would be detailed in your validation master plan here. By managing all of those aspects appropriately and effectively, you will maintain the validation status of your site. So how do we maintain a validated state of control? Well, that includes, but it's not limited to some of the following. So change control, which we're going to be going into in a lot more detail in a minute. Making sure your documents are controlled. So we have to make sure that the steps in our SOPs, our protocols, systems are all up to date with the regulations. And if we don't manage our documents properly, making sure that people have the correct, most approved, most current version of an SOP or a protocol, then we're not managing the state of control of our systems or our processes. Preventative maintenance is obviously what keeps our equipment in tip-top shape. So it's all very well to have validated it day one, but if we don't maintain it going forward, then you're going to end up with loss of capability of your process or your equipment. Likewise, calibration goes along with that. So calibration is our means to reassert that everything is working as it should. And if we see issues occurring during calibration, well then maybe we need to reassess our piece of equipment to see if it needed to be revalidated. Training is crucial on a pharmaceutical site also, making sure that people are doing the correct steps and following the correct preventative actions, the correct calibrations, that they're following the proper change control procedures. All of these things are critical to make sure that your system is staying in a validated state of control. How we document, how we use our equipment, how we clean our equipment, and any unplanned maintenance that might happen on our equipment would be very critical, because that gives us the background to any problems that arise. So if we do see an issue, we can go back to our logbooks or our worksheets and we can see, well, we've had this issue before and this is what happened and this is a trend we're seeing on this piece of equipment. So it gives us a lot more information to base our decisions on. Annual product reviews are a really important way to take a snapshot of the whole site and to see how we're doing and how we're managing our processes. We're going to be talking about those further on in this lesson. Requalification and revalidation will sometimes be necessary. We're going to talk about that again in a minute as well. So the validation master plan, well, what is it? First of all, it describes the overall philosophy, the intention and the approach to establishing a validation policy for a site. So it's a really important overriding document for the site. It is nearly always reviewed as part of a regulatory inspection. It'll be one of the key pieces of documents a regulator would look at because it gives an over-encompassing version of what validation activities are happening on any given site. It identifies which items are subject to validation and to qualification and the nature and the extent of those qualifications and validations that you would be performing on your processes, your utilities, your facility, your system, your cleaning, all of your validation topics. It defines necessary protocols and procedures for the site, so what SOPs you should have in place, what protocols you would expect to see for each of your validation activities, and it gives guidance as to how you should approach that. It should list the product CQAs, the critical to quality attributes, and the CPPs, the critical process parameters for your site. It would always be signed off by validation, quality, engineering, production and maintenance, and project management if there is one, at a minimum. So it's an important site document that has a lot of input from lots of departments. It should be used as a means of effective project management, so it defines the responsibilities, the project schedules and the overall GMP philosophy for the site. What your validation master plan contains then? So it's quite a lengthy document. You would expect obviously to see your table of contents up front. Your title page and your authorizations are very important. So who signed off? It would have a description of the facility, including the plans and the drawings. You would expect to see some P&ID drawings in there. It gives the constitution of the validation committee, so who's responsible for validation on the site. Glossary of terms, The validation plan. So the what you're going to do, the when you're going to do it, where you're going to do it, and the how you're going to do it. So all of the details around how you manage your validation. It gives the purpose and the approach to validation. So it's concise, but it's detailed, and it demonstrates what critical equipment, facilities, and procedures you have on the site. It also addresses how you manage your change controls, what equipment qualifications you have, the scope of the validation activities, again, that relates to your equipment, your utilities, and your processes and procedures. What are the impacts to product quality? Roles and responsibilities. So who's responsible for managing the protocols? Who's responsible for the validation activities? Who's responsible for the SOPs? Outsourced activities. So will some of your activities for validation be outsourced to a contract company? If so, who and what and when and how? Your validation master plan will address how deviations and change controls will be managed during the validation activities. Risk-based principles in validation. So in further lessons, we're going to be talking about the ICH guidelines about risk management, and you can take that approach to your validation activities on a site. So we'll be talking about that in a little bit more detail. If you decide to go down that road, you would be detailing your logic and your criteria in your validation master plan. What is your way of managing training for validation activities? That would be again detailed. All validations that would be required for the site. So description of your facilities, you would be including all areas that would be affected by GMP, by manufacturing. You would be identifying your critical GMP areas and maybe listing your non-GMP areas as well and differentiating between the two. And you would be describing what manufacturing and cleaning processes would need to be validated. The validation matrix then is a list of required validation in the facility in the order of its criticality. So you would know what processes, equipment, facility areas need to be done as a priority, and they would be listed in your validation matrix. You might have some references then for your validation master plan. So the validation master plan is quite a comprehensive document, and it would be one of the site's more important pieces of documentation. If you're working in a validation capacity, it would be really important that you would have reviewed it and be familiar with the contents of it. Change control. So why do we have to have change control? Well, a process, once it's validated, remains validated unless something changes. Changes then have to be evaluated to assess if revalidation or other actions are required, such as training or updating an SOP, etc. The impact of the changes must be determined before the change is made, so you prevent unanticipated consequences from happening. Any change, no matter how minor it is, to a validated process or a piece of equipment could render it invalidated. It's therefore really important that any such changes are made via a formal change control system. The formal change control system then will identify if revalidation is necessary or not. So if your change is a like for like. So like for like could be changing out a component or a piece of equipment for the exact same part or specification. Outlines the level of requalification or revalidation that is required to maintain a validated state. And it also assesses the impact on registration. So the registration that we have filed with the regulators as to how we manufacture our product is extremely detailed. If we make changes to a process particularly, we have to assess that change before it's made to ensure that it doesn't conflict with what we have registered with the regulators. There are different types of changes you can have. The first is the most common one, and that's our planned change. So changes that we plan in advance, we're doing it on a logic, scientific-based reason, because we know that the change that we would make could improve our operations, make it more effective, more efficient. It could improve safety, or it could improve cost. We might be making a cost reduction. So we've planned it in advance. We know what the consequence is going to be, and we know who's involved, what we need to do, and everything is organized and planned. The second type is an emergency change. So that would be something that we would have to do to ensure continued operation of a system. So for example, if we had a software going down and we needed to put a patch onto our software in order to keep the equipment running, so that might need to happen a lot faster and might need to happen during the night shift. Our changes are categorized as minor or major. So can you think of examples of each of these? A minor change control and a major change control. So a minor change control would be something where you've got a like for like. So if you were changing out a filter and you were putting in the exact same make and model and specification back in, that would be a like for like. And that's a very, very straightforward change control. You're just notifying that a change has been made. There is no changes The second main minor type might be no GMP impact. So you might be changing out a filter, but it could be from a different manufacturer. Say, for example, you couldn't source your current manufacturer anymore, or they were out of stock, and you had to put in a replacement part, but it came from a different manufacturer. It had the same parameters, the same specifications. It would still need to be evaluated. It wouldn't be a like-for-like change because it's from a different manufacturer. So there could be other issues with it that you mightn't have encountered before, but it would still be a minor change. A major change then would be the greatest possible impact on GMP compliance. So something like changing out a raw material, for example, or if you were going to modify the layout of a clean room or change a process parameters. In all likelihood, a major change would require a revalidation or some component of a revalidation. So we'll be having a look at things that require revalidation in a couple of minutes. When is change control used? Change involves planned or unplanned alteration to any of the following. So your materials, if you're changing out your starting materials, your in-process materials, if you're changing your equipment, so if you're altering your settings, if you're changing out components in your equipment, if you're changing utilities to your equipment. So if you're changing your vacuum, your solvent lines, your purified water system, anything like that needs to be managed. If you're changing out any of your procedures, you would have a specific change control process for that. It mightn't go through the site change control. It might be documented in an SOP control procedure. How you manage changes to your procedures, because that's really important. If you make changes to your procedures, that could be a corrective action from a change control or a deviation. So you've encountered a problem and you've assessed that we need to update how we use this piece of equipment. You want to document that in your SOP for that piece of equipment. You need to make sure that that's managed and that's captured, because if it isn't, that same issue will keep reoccurring. Analytical test methods, obviously if you change anything in your test methods, you will need to do a change control on that, because that is very critical. It's giving you critical information about your product. In-process controls, likewise, again, you're getting very critical information about your product. You need to be sure that any changes you make are not going to adversely affect that. It goes without saying, if you're going to change your manufacturing processes, you would need to do a change control on that. If you're changing your agitation, your temperature, your drying time, any of those types of processes would need to be assessed to make sure that you're not affecting your critical to quality attributes. Your analytical methods or your material specifications, again, how you're testing your raw materials coming in or how you're testing your finished products going out, making sure that any changes are still capturing all the information that you need and that they're compliant with the pharmacopoeias as well. Primary packaging specifications, so the first layer of packing that touches your product, is obviously really important because that could affect the stability of your product and it could protect the integrity of your product as well. So any changes to that would have to be addressed to make sure that they were okay. Changes to computer systems, software or hardware would need to be assessed, and brand new equipment coming in anywhere in the plant, even including the labs, would need to go through change control. So change control assessment is required if the answer is yes to any of these questions. Does the change affect CGMPs? Does the change affect validated systems? And does the change affect regulatory compliance? Regulators would be very interested in how a site manages change control, because it's one of the key ways of ensuring that you're maintaining your validated state of your equipment, your systems, your processes, etc. Change control has two purposes. Number one, to prevent unanticipated consequences. Number two, to maintain validation integrity. And validation and change control are legally required in the GMPs, as we mentioned, but they also make good business sense. Revalidation. To evidence that changes in a process and or process environment, introduced either intentionally or unintentionally, do not adversely affect process characteristics and product quality. So you have two basic categories for when revalidation might occur. The first one is if you have in your validation master plan scheduled periodic revalidation. So you might say something is so important that we need to revalidate it on every 2 years, every 4 years, every 6 months, whatever. And you would outline that from the regulations, or it might come from the site validation master plan. The second reason would be from your change control process, so where you would have revalidation after a change to the product, the plant, or the manufacturing process. So this is just a list of some of the things, the changes that would require revalidation. So if you changed your raw material, so if you have a new material, or if you had changes to the physical properties of your raw material where there was some kind of a modification in terms of viscosity or particle size or specific gravity or any physical characteristics like that, so either the active ingredient or the excipient would need revalidation based on changes. Packaging material, as we mentioned, packaging material comes into contact with the product and hence it has potential to affect the stability and the quality of the product, and it would need revalidation. Support systems. So if you've got changes to systems like your purified water or your steam generation or even like electronic batch records, all of those would be critical support systems and would require revalidation. Manufacturing process changes. So if you've changes to like things like timing, temperature, agitation speeds, that will require revalidation to make sure no impact on the critical to quality characteristics. Changes to equipment. So if you've got new equipment or there's been changes made to equipment, it has to be assessed to make sure that there's no impact to the product. So if you've changed out a part or a component or a setting on your equipment, that would all need to be assessed. So those are some of the changes that would require revalidation. And again, that would generally happen either through your validation master plan, where you've documented it as being a periodic requirement, or through your change control system. Annual product review is another important means of maintaining the validated state of your site. In Subpart J of your CFRs, it mandates having a written annual product review process, and it recommends review of a representative number of approved as well as your rejected batches. The annual product review is more than just a regulatory requirement. An APR helps the manufacturer to understand processes and to make further improvements. The guidelines stress the importance of analysing investigations and deviations conducted and product complaints received, while the APR report must explore in-depth causes of recalls and returns, if there was any. The APR is often requested by inspector. It gives an overview of the entire site systems and the processes, and it identifies any trends. All the batches of a product manufactured in the financial year are included. Each set of data has to be tabulated and graphed so it's easy to display the results, and it's very easy to see any trends that are occurring then. It's reviewed by the senior management team. So the annual product review, it has details about process deviations and change controls. So all product or process deviations, investigations conducted for deviations, or change control for changes in procedures or in product parameters shall be recorded. Any corrective actions that were derived from these changes and affect these changes on product quality have to be summarised as well. Out of specification and out of trend results. So all the cases of out of specification for a particular product, your API, your in-process, your finished product and your packing component that are filed by quality control during the respective financial year shall be mentioned, if there was any. Any out of trend results, if any have been observed during stability studies, also need to be recorded. Non-conformance report. So any details of non-conformances generated in the financial year for a particular product have to be mentioned as well. Product complaints. So complaints can come back from the marketplace, they can come back from pharmacies, they can come back from doctors. You can get customer complaints back as well from sister sites or from other sites who are continuing your processing. So you need to summarise any product complaint that comes back, and you have to trend any problematic batches. Returned goods or recalled products. Obviously, any details of these need to be listed in your APR. Yield reconciliation. So the yield of the batches of the product is reconciled. So this again is a means of showing how in control your process is. Where are you losing yield to? If you see trends where yield is going up or down, the reasons need to be elucidated in your APR as well. Adverse drug reactions. So if you've got any complaints on or data on adverse drug reactions, you need to summarise those also in your annual product review. Environmental conditions during the manufacturing operation. So details of environmental conditions during manufacturing. So if you had any issues with your HVAC system, for example, if it went out of specification, if you had out of trend highs or lows in terms of your humidity, your temperature control, any of those types of things, they would need to be investigated and they would need to be detailed in your APR. Critical equipment performance. So critical equipment used during manufacturing of product shall be identified, and the overall performance of these equipment has to be evaluated by reviewing the breakdown and preventative maintenance records. Management of any raw material or suppliers. So manufacturing or supplier who's supplying an active ingredient, they have to be approved, and if you were seeing trends of issues with your API or your excipient batches coming in, that would have to be investigated also. Active pharmaceutical ingredient data. The data of the API shall be collected and recorded appropriately. The data shall include the name of the ingredient, the manufacturer supplier name and address, the number of consignments received, the number of consignments approved. Conclusions and recommendations. The conclusion regarding process consistency with respect to yield, quality, stability, and recommendations to continue the manufacture as per the process being followed. It's really important that the validation status of the facility, the equipment, the process and utility is kept in check. The mechanisms for achieving the maintenance of validation status are many, but the key ones include having a good validation master plan, performing revalidations where necessary, having a well-functioning change control system, a thorough annual product review to identify and address any trends. Over to you. What is a validation master plan? How does change control ensure that validation status is maintained? What should be included in the APR? Thank you for your time and attention. We'll see you again for the next lesson.